first generation of women, and sorry to say, perhaps now the only one surviving, that broke into the bastions, male journalism at that time. They just didn't want a woman in their reporters' rooms. And I looked at the ticket. I opened up my son's atlas and I said, my God, Mexico City is the other side of the world. And I can go to it by the west and or I can go to it by the east. And so I said, my God, the story for a journalist is to be in Vietnam now. And I went to the foreign secretary. How can you want to go there? And I said, well, Mr. Vishnu Trivedi, but that was his name. Mr. Trivedi, I haven't come for a lecture. I just came to ask you to help. And he said, okay, if that's what you want, I will send a letter to them.
Today, I have the honor to speak with Rami Chhabra. She is an accomplished author and a pioneering voice in the realm of women's rights and social activism. She is debuting in the world of novels with her latest work, which is titled Becoming the Storm. In this book, she delves into the life of a 16-year-old girl called Indu. In this book, Indu grapples with her dreams of independence against the backdrop of familial expectations and societal norms in post-independence India. Very welcome to you, ma'am, on our show.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I want to begin this conversation by telling you that before this discussion, I was reading your work. I was reading about you. I was going through all the work that you have done as a journalist also. And I saw that you are one of those people who not only have covered the issues from far away, but you have gone to places and you have met people, you have understood their issues. Tell us about us. All of this vast experience that you hold is the inspiration behind this book.
Where do I begin? I'm 86 now, and I started writing when I was 18. And so it's been a lifetime of writing, meeting people, which is why I thought that I would write this book, which I wrote during the COVID period when I finally had the time and the tranquility to just sit with, no going out, nobody bothering you to say, come here, come there. So it was in a way, it turned out to be a good personal time for me when I could introspect and look inwards. And so I thought nostalgically about the years when I was growing up and what the city looked like then, what life was like then. And so apart from what I had myself seen or experienced, there were these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories that I had gathered with the columns that I started writing. I had a regular column, first in the Statesman. I edited the Hindustan Times women's page at the age of 22 to begin with. And then I moved on to writing a column of my own in the Statesman, which was then one of the most prestigious papers in the country. And I ran that column for a decade and a half and gave it up when I had moved on to many other things that then did not allow me to spend the time ferreting out the information that I needed to do that column. So this book is the essence of a lot that people have shared with me. And so while it is one story, it is really the story of many, many, many.
We say that this is a work of fiction, but the story of Indu must resonate with a lot of people that you have met and you have heard stories of. If for our viewers, you can tell a little bit about the character of Indu.
Okay, well, I start with the book as Indu as a 16-year-old girl who's just joined college. And while she has dreams and her father has dreams for her, to go into a career, because this is already post-independent India, the mid 50s that we're talking about already. The book begins in 1955. And so, this is on the cusp of the Hindu Code Bill being brought in, and people getting progressive in their thoughts, although there is the strong stranglehold of tradition still existing. And so the father is ambitious that she should sit for the IS exam, which is what a lot of ambitious fathers wanted for their daughters at that time. The mother is equally frantic to get her married, because the mothers were always, they thought they had got married and they had had a satisfactory life being looked after. And so perhaps their agenda was to see that their daughters got fixed up and lived happily ever after, kind of thing. So here is Indu struggling to carry on with her studies while her mother is showing her boy after boy. And she finally succumbs when there is a very suitable boy that comes to her from destiny in various ways. And that's all part of the story, that how uh, karma plays its role. And so Indu succumbs and she agrees to get married, but she thinks that it's not a compromise really, because she's negotiated that she will carry on studying. But then she finds when she gets married, for one thing, it was a time when girls were still innocent, unaware of how to protect themselves. And so there's a pregnancy right there in the honeymoon. And and then there are in-laws, like in-laws were for many in those days, and which is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, for many still, for many still. And so she is oppressed and battles her way through life. But I want to say that the message that I tried to give was, I mean, as you pointed out, I have been a pioneer both in terms of becoming a journalist myself as a one of the first generation of women, and sorry to say, perhaps now the only one surviving, that broke into the bastions of male journalism at that time. They just didn't want a woman in their reporters' rooms at that stage. But also, having done that, perhaps I was one of the few women, uh, not just one of the few women, perhaps the only woman at that time, who didn't want to compete with the men to get assignments to report on crime and law and order and, all the male things that male reporters aspire to make a career for themselves. And therefore, women wanted to do the same. Because I had already got married, also alongside writing, and had seen that there were many issues that concerned women that were not getting the media exposure that they should. And I strongly felt then, I'm talking about 50 years ago, that women's issues were as important, if not more, than all the issues of politics, economics, many other things that we were writing about. So I chose to concentrate on women. And not only did I do this column for a decade and a half in the Statesman, which was called Woman About Town, but I negotiated, and that is a story in itself, because uh, I may digress for a minute, but my columns in the Statesman led to an invitation to become a UN fellow in the very first women's conference, the UN Women's Conference that was held in Mexico City in 1975, the International Women's Year, where we went and we found there were 5,000 women delegates there. And suddenly you realize that the issues that you were dealing with, because you sort of intuitively felt that these were important, were actually that important, that women from across the world, across the globe, were coming and speaking the same language, and that the United Nations was recognizing this was so. So that was one part. But the other part was that when the invitation came to me and I looked at the ticket, I opened up my son's atlas and I said, my God, Mexico City is the other side of the world. And I can go to it by the west and or I can go to it by the east. And this was the time when Vietnam war had just ended. And, the most iconic scenes in the newspaper at that time were of this helicopter that was taking off. And there were people clinging to its wheels because they were so desperate to get out of Saigon, as it was known then. And there was no scope to do so. And so I said, my God, the story for a journalist is to be in Vietnam now. And I went to the foreign secretary, whom I happen to know for, through some reason. Uh, Another very interesting story that I cannot digress into, but anyway, I knew him. And I said, I would like to get a visa to go in, some diplomatic um, thing to get permission to go into Vietnam. And he looked at me and he said, what's the matter with you? Because we haven't got our postal bag from our diplomats in Saigon. We don't know if they're alive or they're dead. So how can you want to go there? And I said, well, Mr. Vishnu Trivedi, that was his name, Mr. Trivedi, I haven't come for a lecture. I just came to ask you to help. And he said, okay, if that's what you want, I will send a letter to them. And to cut a long story short, I got the permission because the Foreign Secretary of India had written to the Vietnamese who were very indebted to India for the role that India had played in supporting them through the years. And so when the Foreign Secretary wrote, they immediately said yes. And I got notice that I was being allowed into Vietnam in Mexico City itself. And I can't go into all those stories. I have another book, Breaking Ground, my memoirs, which your audience could read. And
Well,
it tells all, but what, I want to complete this. It tells all of how I got into Vietnam and what I did there. And it was a world scoop. But the reason I started telling you this was that I then came back, and my editor, who had always wanted me to write and always gave me a column, had given me the women's page to edit in the Hindustan Times when I was 22, and this was now 10 years later, 12 years later. Um, when he wanted me to do some stories, and I said, Mr. Malgonkar, one of the most illustrious editors the country has known, and I said, Mr. Malgonkar, I've written all this time what you wanted me to write, but now I think I proved myself. Because, for 3 weeks running, the front page of the Sunday magazine of the Indian Express at that time ran my journey through Vietnam. And it was the talk of the town. The Prime Minister, then Indira Gandhi, height of the emergency, invited me to talk with her. All kinds of things happened. And I said, I've proven myself, so I now need to write what I believe in. And he said, what is that? And I said, sir, I need an edit page column to write about the political issues that involve women. And so a feminist viewpoint was born in the Indian Express. It ran for a couple of years, and it was, at that time, one of the most prestigious columns for women, because the Indian Express was the only paper that had 12 different editions, and people across the country read it. So, my background as working for women's issues goes that far.
yeah, it's so gripping to even hear about all of these experiences that you have had. I'm wondering how it was like to live them.
How to live
Uh,
them? Well, I've had a very interesting life,
yeah.
and I, I thank I thank my guru above for giving me this life.
Now
And
I also, yeah.
yeah, and I want to say I've enjoyed being a woman. I've enjoyed being a woman, and I would never be anything but a woman in my next life. But I battled to fight for a recognition for women's dignity, for their empowerment, because one realized that millions of women were deprived in this country. We had supposedly, at the dawn of independence, got equality, but it was on paper, not in practice. And in fact, 1975, when I'm talking of Mexico City and the thing, was also a turning point in the women's uh, issues as such, because that was when the Towards Equality report was brought out. It was a report that was commissioned by the government for this Mexico City conference because they hoped to present a picture of a ideal India where the women were, this other nation where half man, half woman, and women were doing everything. And then this report came, which was devastating, which documented all the problems that were existing in the thing. And of course, they suppressed it. They wouldn't put it out. Um, and again, journalists like me and many others played a role in writing about the report and saying, why is it a CBI report that it can't be brought out? And we got it out. We got it discussed in Parliament. So, 75 was a turning point year, both for women in the country, in the political plane, and for me personally, because I was able to step with that into a broader role than I had had in earlier years.
Ma'am, the book that you have written, Becoming the Storm, it is with the backdrop of early years of post-independence India. If you have to replace that backdrop with what is called the so-called modern society,
The launch of the book, that's what I spoke, that while I wanted to record the nostalgia that one felt for what I call the innocence and idealism of that early independence years, which kind of permeated the atmosphere and gave us women, gave all of us, men and women, aspirations to do something for the nation and the broad and good dreams of what could be done and the confidence that we could do it, that kind of which is what I also have conversations of Indu talking with her friends and saying, like the poet, isn't it good to be alive at this time, to be young and to be alive, and everything is so wonderful. So I wanted to capture that, but I, with all that I had seen and heard, with the columns that I had done, and the battles that I have fought all my life for women's issues now, it could not be just a pleasant, beautiful recapturing of that old bygone era. I felt there were regressive social mores and that brings me to answering your question more pointedly, that we thought we were fighting because some of the earliest things that the women's movement took up in protesting, we formed at the Hej Varodi Chetna Manch. And we brought about the anti-dowry bill, we brought about the anti-obscenity bill, many things that we felt strongly about. But sitting back now in these COVID years, I said, but what happened? 90s, my daughter came back from the US and made a powerful documentary film. The Brides Are Not for Burning, because she got into the suffering hospital and found the wards full of women that were victims because of it. And I saw that the statistics were, in fact, not improving, but going upwards and upwards and upwards. And, dowry deaths in the last 10 years alone have been, as Brinda Karat has brought out in her book on violence against women, that more women have died from dowry deaths in the last 10 years than the number of soldiers killed in all the wars that have been fought by independent India. So you can imagine, and that's only a 10-year slice. I mean, this is horrendous because when you look at the crimes against women, domestic violence is more than a third of the thing. And if you look at the dowry deaths alongside, 11%. So I felt that what I would say about that time, putting it in that time, because it happened also in that time, but it has not improved. It's got much worse. And so the contemporary scene, if I juxtapose the contemporary scene, I would say that at least then we had the idealism backing us, the backdrop. So there's few of us. I mean, as I write in the book, nostalgically again of Indira Gandhi's marriage, where her father wore her a khadi sari in the jail, which she wore, and she put flowers in her hair. And today's generation now looks at the Ambanis and sees how the wedding spectacle, which brought the world to their door, is the aspirational model. And I say to myself, good God, but how many can be those Ambanis, and leave the Ambanis alone? I mean, I documented this at the book launch. The Economic Times has brought out these issues that the expenditure on weddings has become the second biggest industry in the country, second only to grocery and food. And that Indians are spending twice as much on weddings as they do on education from the primary to the graduation level. Horrendous facts, horrendous facts. And so I would say that the book, by putting it all in another time, still is urging you to think about issues that are even more relevant today than they were then, and even more difficult today than they were then. Because as I said, then we at least had different aspirational models. And the problems were occurring because we were innocently skimming the surface, thinking we've got equality, everything is happening, but we were not seeing the submerged sector. But today, you don't have those excuses. And what is happening is that what has happened for women, and many things have happened, but it's happened for a little cream, uh, certain select group right at the top who can afford to fight their battles, ensure that their husbands toe the line, ensure the in-laws are with them, and if they aren't, divorce and walk out. But for the large majority, you see that.
Ma'am, how different do you think is fiction from your earlier writing, your non-fiction book earlier? How different it is, because the way that you narrate things, I feel it's a cakewalk for you to write fictional work.
Well, you know, one of the things that this Becoming the Storm tries to bring out is that early marriage is disastrous because the young woman has to, she's not equipped to fight the battles that she then is plunged into fighting. And so I hope that the focus comes, and it's very relevant again, I should say, in contemporary terms, because even today, when the age of marriage is rising, you have 22.5% of all married women, married under the age of 18, which is the legal age. So, the underage marriage is still a major issue. And, I wrote my first statistical paper documenting this whole issue of age of marriage in 1982. And, I moved into demographics, I moved into family planning very strongly because of the number of articles that I wrote in the feminist viewpoint that I talked about earlier. And this was during the emergency, when family planning became one of the most political issues that there was, and explosive. I got invited in by J.R.D. Tata at that time to come in and help re-legitimize family planning, because I was writing that no matter what happened during the emergency, what was not happening for family planning afterwards was far more disastrous for the women and children of this country than anything that had happened in the Shah Commission that had then been set up was examining. And so they said, come, put your money where your mouth is, or put your mouth where your money is, whatever that saying goes. And I worked in population issues. And so at that time, brought to the attention of the Planning Commission, of the powers that be, because they were all right now, like you hear about the TFR, There's a lot of conversation that the total fertility rate is going down. And, there's a hangama around that now. In the early days, it was more children were being born. And the idea was to control it. And so there was always this talk about, at that time, it was the NRR of one, net reproduction rate of one should be achieved in the country. And that it would be achieved if the number of births and the number of deaths became balanced rather than many more births than deaths taking place in the country, so that there was this staggering addition to the population each year. And I brought this paper to the attention of, and it's been a much again talked sociologically important talked about paper, which showed that the nuptiality factor was the ignored factor in all these calculations that they were doing. And so I said, if there was later marriage, which automatically brought, because fortunately, we were still at that point something that is loosening now and worrisome, but we were then still a country very much where births took place within marriage, not outside it. And so we said if there was later marriage, there would be fewer births. And the generation gap would be far more important than any contraceptive gap would bring about. But, while I got into the National Population Commission and I got all kinds of opportunities to speak at seminars and whatnot, there was never adequate attention to any of these matters. And so, I could go have another program altogether telling you about how one spoke about issues that mattered in population, but they fell by the wayside because the men that were there didn't recognize the importance of what this perspective, which is a women's perspective, was bringing about. So, in fact, I've retreated into fiction because I find that the fact-filled world isn't getting you anywhere. And I just hope that a fictional story is powerful enough for people to feel a universal message there, and that becoming the storm does kick up a storm. So,
You have answered my question quite nicely and elaborately. And yes, I do believe that a work of fiction can resonate with more and more people out there.
yeah.
Any future works or any future projects that you are going to bring about?
The book ends on a cliffhanger.
Okay.
And at the book launch, people asked me, what then? What then? And I said, maybe a sequel.
That's trending these days, yeah.
I don't know. But certainly, all I can say is that if there are enough readers, if is enough interest, maybe I will have found another genre of writing at this old age.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Rami ma'am, for speaking with us and taking out the time. And I sure hope that we can get to chat yet another time when your next book comes out.
Well, I hope that you speak with me about other issues long before my next book comes.
All right, great to hear that. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.